There's a strange kind of abundance sitting quietly at the edge of your memory. It does not come in a glossy bag, it does not carry a brand name, and it does not sit neatly stacked on shelves under bright fluorescent lights. Most people walk past it every single day without recognizing what it is. It drifts upward in soft gray clouds from a fire, settles into a pile that looks like nothing, and is usually swept away without a second thought. But there was a time when this powder was guarded, saved, even transported across continents because of what it could do. There was a time when entire harvests depended on it, when farmers treated it less like waste and more like quiet insurance against hunger. And if you've ever stood in a garden wondering why growth feels slow, why the soil feels tired, why the results never quite match the effort. And this is where the story begins to shift, because what you've been taught to buy might not be what your soil actually needs. And what you've been throwing away might be the missing piece that changes everything. The year is not so far away that it feels like ancient history, but far enough that most people never think to look back. Early 1940s. A government lab. Quiet, methodical, filled with soil samples labeled in careful handwriting. One researcher, patient enough to spend years asking a question most people would ignore. Why do some fields thrive while others struggle, even when they're given the same commercial inputs? It wasn't a flashy question. It didn't promise headlines, but it carried a kind of weight that only comes from watching patterns repeat themselves without explanation. So he did the work, farm after farm, soil after soil, different regions, different climates, different farming styles, and what started as curiosity slowly became something harder to ignore. The most productive land wasn't the most expensive to maintain. It wasn't the land receiving the newest products or the most aggressive treatments. It was something simpler, something older, something that didn't come from a factory at all. The difference, quietly repeated across those farms, was ash, not processed, not refined, not packaged, just the remains of burned wood returned to the earth. If you pause here for a second, and I mean really pause, this is one of those moments where it's worth thinking about how often we overlook the obvious. If this kind of thing interests you, if you find yourself drawn to these small, hidden patterns, you might want to stick around, not because of a channel or a button, but because once you start noticing this, you'll see it everywhere. The findings didn't feel dramatic on paper, but they were. Soil enriched with wood ash showed stronger plant growth, deeper root systems, and faster development cycles. The explanation wasn't mysterious. Wood ash carries a dense concentration of minerals that plants actually use: potassium, calcium, trace elements that support everything from root strength to fruit production. But more importantly, it delivers them in a form that interacts naturally with the soil instead of overwhelming it. And yet, none of this was new. Long before laboratories and controlled trials, people had already figured this out. Not through theory, but through survival. In regions where soil was poor, where harvest failure meant real consequences, small discoveries mattered. Burning plant material and returning the ash to the ground wasn't just a habit. It was a pattern that kept working, generation after generation. In parts of the world where soil should have been exhausted centuries ago, it remained rich, dark, fertile, alive in a way that didn't match its age. The secret wasn't hidden in some rare material. It was built slowly, layer by layer, through the repeated use of what most people would call waste. There's something quietly humbling about that. The idea that the solution isn't always something new, sometimes it's something remembered. And if you're still here, still following this thread, I'm curious what you're thinking. Not a comment for the algorithm kind of way, but genuinely, had you ever seen something like this in your own space? A small habit that made a bigger difference than expected. Those are the things that tend to matter more than we realize. As time moved forward, agriculture didn't stay simple. It expanded, industrialized, optimized. Efficiency became the priority. Scale became the goal. And with that shift came a different way of thinking about soil. Not as something living, but as something to be managed, corrected, adjusted with precise inputs. On paper, it made sense. Standardize the nutrients, control the ratios, remove unpredictability. But in doing so, something subtle was lost. The connection between natural cycles and long-term soil health started to fade. Into the background, products replaced practices, systems replaced instincts. And here's where things get complicated, but because once an industry builds itself around a certain model, it doesn't just exist, it protects itself. Not always in obvious ways, not always through direct opposition. Sometimes it's quieter than that. A shift in recommendations, a change in what gets taught, a gradual reframing of what is considered reliable and what is considered outdated. Wood ash didn't disappear overnight. It just slowly stopped being mentioned. Less present in guides, less discussed in classrooms, less visible in the conversation. And when something stops being talked about, it doesn't take long before it starts to feel like it never existed at all. If this feels a little unsettling, that's understandable. It should, because it raises a question that's bigger than gardening. How many useful things fade out of common knowledge, not because they stop working, but because they stop fitting into a system built around something else? Take a moment here, seriously. If this is hitting something for you, if it's making you look at things a little differently, consider staying connected, not out of obligation, but because these kinds of ideas tend to build on each other. And missing one piece sometimes makes the next one harder to see. Now, none of this means that modern solutions are useless. That's not the point. The point is balance, awareness, knowing that there are options beyond what's packaged and sold. Because when you understand what ash actually does, it stops being this abstract concept and becomes something practical, something usable. Applied correctly, it can gently raise soil pH in acidic conditions, making nutrients more available to plants. It can support stronger root development, which translates to more resilient growth above ground. It can improve overall soil structure in ways that don't rely on repeated purchases. But, and this matters, it's not about dumping it everywhere. Like anything, it requires attention. Too much can shift soil conditions too far. The type of wood matters. Clean, untreated sources only. No shortcuts, no assumptions. This isn't a miracle. It's a tool. And maybe that's the part that makes it easy to overlook, because it doesn't promise instant transformation. It works quietly over time in a way that doesn't demand attention. Kind of like most things that actually last. There's also something personal in this, whether you realize it or not. The idea that something from your own space, your fire, your routine, your environment, can feed back into itself, that you're not entirely dependent on something external too, makes things grow. That shift, even a small one, changes how you see what you already have. If you've made it this far, I just want to say this. Thank you for staying with the thought. Not everyone does. Most people skim, jump, move on, but sitting with an idea long enough to let it unfold, that's rare. And it matters more than metrics ever will. So where does that leave you? Not with a command, not with a checklist, but with a different perspective. The next time you see ash, it won't look the same. The next time you think about soil, you might question what it actually needs instead of what you've been told it needs. And maybe that's enough to start with. Because knowledge like this doesn't need to be forced. It doesn't need to be sold. It just needs to be remembered, shared, passed quietly from one person to another. If this opens something for you, even a small shift in how you think, hold on to that. Share it with someone who might see it the same way. Not because you have to, but because that's how things like this stay alive. And if you decide to come back, to keep exploring these kinds of buried ideas, you'll probably start noticing a pattern. The most valuable things are rarely the loudest. They're the ones that wait quietly until someone pays attention again.